Greetings to everyone tuning in. Today, we're about to embark on a whimsical journey through the quirky universe of one of the most beloved sci-fi spoofs of all time, Spaceballs. This comedic gem has more surprises behind the scenes than you might imagine, and we're here to explore every twist and turn of its production story. Let's jump right in. 1. The hardware wars connection. Long before Spaceballs ever soared onto movie screens, there was a scrappy little short film from 1977 called Hardware Wars. Imagine a Star Wars parody created by an amateur filmmaker, Arnie Facilius, who had all the ambition in the galaxy but only a shoestring budget to make it happen. He spent a mere $8,000 putting his film together in a location far less glamorous than a big studio backlit, an abandoned laundromat. That's right. While other productions might have had state-of-the-art sets, Hardware Wars had rows of old washers and dryers that were transformed into a makeshift science fiction playground. What made Hardware Wars so unforgettable was its cheeky replacement of grand interstellar spaceships with everyday household objects. If you can picture toasters suspended on strings and entire galactic battles involving tinfoil, you'll have a sense of the comedy gold that had audiences howling. Incredibly, this 12-minute parody earned around $500,000, which was a remarkable return considering the modest filming cost. Even George Lucas himself gave it a nod of approval, calling it a cute little film. But not everyone was beaming with pride. Facilius later accused Spaceballs director Mel Brooks of drawing heavily from his comedic ideas. For Mel Brooks, however, parody was an art form he'd been perfecting for years, and Hardware Wars was just one part of the comedic tapestry that inspired him. Little did anyone know, this humble short film would help set the stage for the intergalactic romp that would follow a decade later in Spaceballs. One hilarious parody paved the way for another, and audiences worldwide would soon discover the sheer joy of laughing at, and celebrating, the sci-fi genre's many tropes. 2. From Planet Moron to Spaceballs. One of the most amusing tidbits in the story of Spaceballs involves the title it almost had. Believe it or not, Mel Brooks initially wanted to call his project Planet Moron. As the story goes, Brooks was at the commissary of 20th Century Fox when a curious studio executive, hungry for inside info, asked about Brooks's next big film. On the spot, Brooks joked, "It's going to be called Planet Moron." That flippant remark sparked a creative flame, and for a while, he genuinely toyed with naming the film after that offhand comment. However, fate had other plans. There was a 1985 British sci-fi comedy called Morons from Outer Space, and Brooks was forced to change gears to avoid confusion. So where did Spaceballs come from? Supposedly, Brooks was brainstorming something catchy, short, and slightly irreverent that would blend his love of screwball comedies with the movie's spacefaring theme. Thus the title Spaceballs was born, an unmistakable nod to the film's mission, to provide an out-of-this-world parody while never taking itself too seriously. Though the name might sound silly at first, it was brilliantly straightforward. With a single word, audiences understood they were heading into comedic territory. Balls conjured images of irreverence and mischief, while space reassured everyone that this was, in fact, a send-up of iconic sci-fi tropes. Mel Brooks's witty naming sense set the tone for the entire project. And while Planet Moron might have been a curious conversation starter, it's hard to deny that Spaceballs rolls off the tongue with a certain playful flair that's stayed with fans ever since. 3. George Lucas's green light, and the merchandise ban. When you think of epic space adventures, chances are Star Wars comes to mind pretty quickly. Naturally, Mel Brooks knew that poking fun at such a beloved franchise could be risky. Despite parody laws that generally protect comedic spoofs, he decided to approach George Lucas directly to keep things friendly, and maybe avoid an intergalactic lawsuit. Lucas, who was busy dealing with the fallout of Howard the Duck at the time, surprisingly gave his thumbs up for the project. But his blessing came with one non-negotiable clause: Spaceballs wasn't allowed to spin off any real merchandise. Why was Lucas so protective? Well, Star Wars had built a veritable empire of toys, action figures, and all sorts of collectibles that helped define the modern movie merchandising machine. Lucas worried that Spaceballs might benefit from that same kind of large-scale marketing. So, Brooks reluctantly agreed to keep his parodies branding out of real-world stores. Of course, in typical Mel Brooks fashion, he turned that restriction into a joke within the movie. Who can forget yogurt proudly peddling everything from Spaceballs toilet paper to Spaceballs lunchboxes, Even a Spaceballs flamethrower, that legendary scene served as both comedic gold and a sly wink at the audience. It called out the very commercialization that Lucas was wary of. Audiences got to laugh at the absurdity of a movie mocking a licensing juggernaut, and in doing so, Spaceballs cemented its status as a parody that not only tickled our funny bones but also cleverly critiqued the business side of sci-fi blockbusters. Point 4. A less-than-stellar box office debut. In hindsight, it's almost surprising to learn that Spaceballs didn't come roaring out of the gate as a monumental box office champion. Released in 1987 on a budget of roughly $22.7 million, it ended up taking in a little over $38 million in U.S. theaters. While that figure didn't exactly spell disaster, it also fell short of the monstrous hits Mel Brooks had delivered in years past, Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein. Reviewers were split. Some hailed it as a comedic triumph, while others dismissed it as too silly, too juvenile, or too reliant on lowbrow gags. Of course, comedic tastes are always a gamble. What one critic finds amusing, another might find ridiculous. And let's not forget the strong shadow cast by Star Wars. When you poke fun at a cultural behemoth, people might have lofty expectations for the satire. Nevertheless, the slightly lukewarm reception didn't deter Mel Brooks. Nor did it dissuade dedicated sci-fi fans who were more than happy to see their beloved genre lovingly roasted. The real magic of Spaceballs took root after its theatrical run ended. It began to thrive on home video rentals, cable TV broadcasts, and word-of-mouth recommendations. Over time, it garnered a devoted following that transformed it into a bona fide cult classic. Entire generations grew up quoting lines like "May the Schwartz be with you," and dressing up as their favorite characters at fan conventions. So while it might not have been a smash hit right away, Spaceballs found a comfortable orbit, proving that some movies just take a little longer to become part of pop culture lore. Point 5. Casting Bill Pullman, the unlikely lone star. When it came to casting the roguish lone star, a character clearly drawing inspiration from Han Solo, Mel Brooks initially had big names in mind. He reportedly reached out to Tom Cruise and Tom Hanks, but both turned the part down. Undeterred, Brooks eventually landed on Bill Pullman, who was relatively unknown to mainstream audiences at the time. The gamble paid off. Pullman's easygoing charisma and comedic timing brought Lone Star to life in a way that was both playful and endearing. Pullman has often spoken about how fortunate he felt to be supported by comedic powerhouses like Rick Moranis, Dark Helmet, and John Candy, Barf. Their star power allowed Brooks to take a chance on a newcomer. After all, if the audience recognized the other leading faces, they might be more open to a fresh face in the hero's seat. It was a creative risk that underscored Brooks's instincts. Sometimes, an actor who isn't yet defined by his resume can bring a certain freshness to a role. Interestingly, Bill Pullman wasn't a major sci-fi buff and reportedly hadn't even watched the Star Wars films before filming Spaceballs. Rather than binge the original trilogy, he trusted Mel Brooks to guide him in capturing the spirit of a spacefaring swashbuckler. The result was a performance that managed to be both comedic and heartfelt, without feeling like a direct imitation of Harrison Ford's iconic smugness. In the end, it's hard to imagine anyone else pulling off Lone Star's blend of casual cool and endearing goofiness. Point 6. Green screens and sunglasses. While today's filmmakers rely heavily on green screen technology, it was still relatively novel back in the mid-1980s. Understandably, the cast and crew of Spaceballs were initially cautious about the health implications of standing in front of a bright green backdrop for extended periods. Rumors circulated about potential eye damage or headaches. Even if those fears were unfounded, the myth alone was enough to cause Bill Pullman and his co-stars to adopt a quirky on-set habit, wearing sunglasses between takes. Imagine seeing Bill Pullman, John Candy, and Rick Moranis decked out in costume, only to pop on Ray-Bans the moment the cameras stopped rolling. It lent a certain rockstar vibe to the production, which was already steeped in comedic eccentricity. Mel Brooks, known for his hands-on, energetic style of directing, found the whole situation more amusing than worrisome. He'd stride onto the set, often playing one of his own characters, and crack jokes about giving their eyes a rest from the blinding green cosmos, as he might have called it. Though the sets were hardly dangerous, the tradition stuck. Eventually, it became one of those behind-the-scenes anecdotes that gets passed around like an inside joke. Some say the sunglasses actually helped the actors stay in character, allowing them a momentary pause from the bright lights and the comedic madness swirling around them. In the end, the only real danger posed by the green screen was that it created an otherworldly palette for comedic brilliance, and Spaceballs capitalized on it perfectly. Point 7. Mel Brooks, 2 characters, 1 severe Rash. Mel Brooks is no stranger to playing multiple roles in his films. Just look at History of the World, Part 1 or Robin Hood, Men in Tights. In Spaceballs, he took the comedic multitasking to new heights by portraying 2 polar opposite characters, the bumbling President Scrub and the wise, Yoda-inspired Yogurt. As if juggling these 2 distinct personas wasn't challenging enough, Brooks had to endure a rather uncomfortable reality. Yogurt's latex makeup wreaked havoc on his skin. From the moment Brooks donned Yogurt's golden, pointy-eared look, his skin began reacting badly. He developed a rash that spread dangerously close to his eyes, making long shoot days a potential nightmare. Ever the consummate professional, Brooks didn't let that stop him, though he did lay down some ground rules. He demanded that the makeup team limit their application process to 1 hour, max. If they took any longer, he threatened to walk off set. This ultimatum put extra pressure on the makeup artists, who had to work at warp speed to transform Brooks into the diminutive sage. Despite these challenges, Brooks soldiered on, delivering comedic lines like only he could. His portrayal of Yogurt remains one of the film's highlights, filled with goofy wisdom and endless merchandising gags. And as President Scrub, he delighted audiences with a farcical depiction of vanity and greed. In many ways, Brooks's dedication to these 2 characters, despite the literal pain, reflects the spirit of Spaceballs itself, imaginative, fearless, and willing to do whatever it takes to keep the audience laughing. Point 8. The many sides of Matrix. Matrix, the sassy and slightly neurotic robot companion to Princess Vespa, is often remembered for Joan Rivers's unmistakable voice. But while Rivers delivered the dialogue with her signature sharp wit, there was another performer behind Matrix's physical presence on set, the accomplished mime Lorene Yarnell. Yarnell was half of the famous mime duo Shields and Yarnell, celebrated for their precise and often humorous movements. Bringing Matrix to life required a careful fusion of comedic timing, physical performance, and costume design. The gold-plated outfit was bulky and could have easily restricted normal motion, but Yarnell's experience in mime allowed her to give Matrix a distinctly robotic quality without sacrificing the comedic flair. Each stiff step and exaggerated arm motion was carefully crafted to keep the illusion intact. Meanwhile, Joan Rivers's voice performance added that essential dash of sarcasm, making Matrix a perfect balance of mechanical rigidity and human-like neuroticism. The result was a character that transcended the typical robot sidekick trope. Matrix had personality. She could be snappy, worried, or even outraged, all while waddling around in her boxy ensemble. Fans loved watching her react to Princess Vespa's dilemmas or Barf's antics, and she often stole the spotlight in scenes loaded with comedic chaos. Looking back, Matrix serves as a testament to how collaboration between voice actor, physical performer, and costume designers can produce movie magic that stands the test of time, proving that sometimes it takes a village to perfect a single, unforgettable role. Point 9. Pizza the Hutt's fiery on-set dilemma. One of Spaceballs' most grotesquely hilarious characters is Pizza the Hutt, a towering mass of gooey cheese and pepperoni who oozes intimidation and mozzarella in every scene. While fans might laugh at the sight of this absurd villain, bringing Pizza to life was no joke. Originally portrayed by actor Richard Caron, the costume was so problematic that it led to a minor on-set crisis. The cheese-like substance, intended to drip for comedic effect, was actually scalding hot once it was lit and layered onto the suit. Caron ended up sustaining burns that were severe enough for him to quit. This abrupt exit left Mel Brooks scrambling for a solution. Effects artist Rick Lazzarini stepped up to wear the costume, enduring the pungent, sticky environment for the sake of getting those essential shots. Meanwhile, Dom DeLuise, who provided Pizza the Hutt's voice, wanted nothing to do with the actual suit from day one. He famously refused to don the cheesy ensemble, likely saving himself from a similar fate. Despite the challenges, Pizza the Hutt remains a standout gag. Whenever he appears, it's impossible not to laugh or cringe at the mountains of artificial cheese and goo sliding across the screen. The visual is simultaneously disgusting and oddly captivating, quintessential Spaceballs. While other villains might rely on menacing lines or shadowy cinematography, Pizza the Hutt's comedic genius lies in its sheer gross-out factor. Behind the scenes, however, that comedic payoff came with real discomfort. Talk about suffering for your art. 10. Barf and the 40-pound battery pack. John Candy's portrayal of Barf, a half-man, half-dog, Mog as he calls himself, is one of the true highlights of Spaceballs. The lovable, dog-eared sidekick stands out for his constant loyalty and bumbling charm. But bringing Barf to life required more than just a set of furry ears and a tail. Behind the scenes, a small team of effects artists was always lurking around, tweaking and operating the animatronic parts that made Barf's ears wiggle and his tail wag. A large battery pack, reportedly weighing around 40 pounds, was strapped to John Candy's back to power these animatronic features. The strain was significant. Candy was essentially carrying around a heavy electronic contraption between takes. Beyond the physical toll, the constant ear and tail movements sometimes proved comically distracting. During key scenes, Barf's ears would twitch so frequently they'd steal the audience's focus away from the main dialogue. Eventually, Mel Brooks requested that the effects team dial down the ear movements to avoid overshadowing the rest of the cast. For Candy, this role was yet another example of his commitment to physical comedy. Whether he was bounding around the set, delivering one-liners, or reacting with wide-eyed confusion to the chaos around him, Candy's warm comedic style paired perfectly with the adorable Mog design. His performance embodied that trademark Spaceballs vibe, ridiculous and over-the-top, yet undeniably endearing. Looking back, it's impressive how much heart he brought to a character weighed down by an actual 40-pound battery rig, and how that effort helped Barf remain a fan favorite to this day. 11. Making peace with Lucasfilm. Despite having George Lucas's personal okay, Mel Brooks still needed top-notch post-production work to keep the Star Wars parody visually sharp. Instead of shopping around, Brooks decided to go straight to the source. He shelled out an estimated $5 million to Lucasfilm for handling the movie's post-production. This collaboration was a crucial olive branch, ensuring that Spaceballs wouldn't ruffle feathers at the very company it was playfully lampooning. The decision to work with Lucasfilm proved invaluable. Not only did Brooks get access to professionals who were masters in sci-fi effects, but it also helped quell any potential legal or creative disputes. After all, Lucasfilm's involvement signaled their implicit blessing beyond just a signature from George Lucas. By maintaining open lines of communication, Brooks ensured that Spaceballs would be a lovingly crafted spoof, rather than a hostile takedown. In a satisfying twist, once Spaceballs wrapped and Brooks sent a final cut over to Lucas, the legendary filmmaker reportedly responded with a heartfelt note praising the project. It was the ultimate sign of respect, a comedic giant tipping his hat to the man behind the sci-fi saga that inspired it all. In that sense, Spaceballs became more than a mere parody. It turned into a collaborative nod to the broader scope of sci-fi cinema, showing that even the biggest franchises can laugh at themselves. Meanwhile, fans were treated to high-quality visuals that still hold up in their own comedic, campy way, thanks to Lucasfilm's touch of authenticity. 12. Bill Pullman's Star Wars blind spot. One of the funniest anecdotes surrounding Spaceballs is the fact that Bill Pullman, who famously played Lone Star, hadn't actually seen the Star Wars trilogy before stepping onto the set. While the rest of the world was well versed in lightsabers and the Force, Pullman was essentially a blank slate. This turned out to be a surprisingly effective advantage. Without the preconceived notions of trying to do Han Solo, he approached Lone Star as a purely comedic hero. Mel Brooks guided him through the general beats of the archetypal space smuggler, a little cocky, a bit of a rogue, but undeniably charming. Pullman took those notes and dialed them to match the film's zany tone. Watching his performance, you see a character who feels faintly reminiscent of Harrison Ford's iconic swagger, but he also carries a uniquely goofy sensibility that's distinctly Spaceballs. Looking back, it's fascinating that the leading man of a Star Wars spoof didn't have that series etched into his mind. Yet sometimes not knowing the source material can free an actor from imitation. Pullman's comedic timing emerged naturally, and his interactions with sidekicks like John Candy's Barf or Rick Moranis' Dark Helmet sparkled with originality. Had he been a die-hard Star Wars devotee, perhaps we would have seen him leaning too hard into parody. Instead, fans got a fresh take on the lovable rogue, proving that sometimes ignorance truly can be comedic bliss. Over time, that blank slate approach became part of the movie's charm, making Lone Star stand out in a sea of spoofs. 13. John Hurt's inside joke, the alien Riff. One of the most memorable cameos in Spaceballs features John Hurt, who famously reprised his terrifying chestburster scene from Alien, but this time with a comedic twist. In Ridley Scott's horror masterpiece, Hurt's character died a brutal death when an alien creature ripped its way out of his chest. For Spaceballs, Mel Brooks flipped the script. Hurt's unfortunate diner patron feels a stir in his belly, the tension builds, and out pops a tiny alien, complete with a top hat and a cane, belting out a spirited rendition of "Hello, My Baby." This hilarious moment wouldn't have been possible without Hurt's willingness to poke fun at his earlier role. Part of the reason he agreed was Mel Brooks's production of The Elephant Man, a film in which Hurt starred and received an Academy Award nomination. That working relationship gave Brooks the leverage to coax Hurt into returning to the dinner table nightmare, this time for laughs, rather than screams. To add another layer of Star Wars homage, eagle-eyed fans might notice the Millennium Falcon parked in the diner's lot during the scene. It's a quick nod to the very universe Spaceballs spoofs, tying it all together in a comedic package. That diner sequence perfectly captures the film's style, a blend of pop culture references, silly gags, and surprising cameos that still manage to shock and delight. For the audience, it's a moment of comedic catharsis, winking at fans of both Alien and Star Wars, proving yet again that Spaceballs thrives on playful intertextuality. 14. The Colonel Sanders that could have been. Spaceballs is peppered with memorable side characters, and Colonel Sanders, Dark Helmet's right-hand man, is no exception. The role ultimately went to George Weiner, who nailed the part with the perfect balance of subservience and comedic timing. But believe it or not, Mel Brooks initially had his sights set on comedy legend Steve Martin for the role. Brooks admired Martin's iconic sense of humor and thought his unique style would offer an extra comedic punch to Dark Helmet's escapades. Unfortunately, scheduling conflicts got in the way, and Martin had to pass. Once Weiner stepped in, the dynamic on set took shape quickly. As Colonel Sanders, he was forced to maintain a straight face while Rick Moranis' Dark Helmet strutted around in that enormous headgear, barking orders like a pint-sized tyrant. Weiner's measured responses and exasperated glances gave the duo an absurd chemistry, like two bumbling henchmen trying to run an evil empire they barely understood. Oddly enough, the name Colonel Sanders itself is a small comedic flourish, conjuring images of fried chicken rather than a space officer. It's another one of those silly details that keep the movie delightfully off-kilter. Fans might imagine an alternate universe where Steve Martin played the role with his trademark physical comedy, but Weiner's performance now feels utterly indispensable. His Colonel Sanders helped solidify Spaceballs' comedic identity, showing that even the smallest part could be a wellspring of laughs. Whether he's sweating through improbable missions or trembling before Dark Helmet, Colonel Sanders remains a fan-favorite sidekick who brings his own distinct brand of comedic absurdity. 15. Rick Moranis and the improvised action figure scene. In the pantheon of unforgettable Spaceballs moments, few can rival the scene where Dark Helmet is caught in his private quarters, playing with miniature action figures of himself and Princess Vespa. The genius behind that bit of comedic gold belongs largely to Rick Moranis, who improvised much of the scene. Suffering from a fever at the time, Moranis found himself in a peculiar creative zone. With cameras rolling, he came up with the now iconic line, "Your helmet is so big." Mel Brooks, who gives his actors room to explore and experiment, let Moranis run wild. The result is an absurd peek into the psyche of Dark Helmet. Here's a maniacal villain reduced to a childlike state, enacting romantic fantasies and petty arguments with plastic dolls. The juxtaposition of a villain trying to conquer the galaxy while secretly playing make-believe adds a layer of hilarious vulnerability to the character. This off-the-cuff brilliance turned a short gag into one of the film's funniest scenes. Even decades later, fans still quote these lines, and the sequence often makes it onto lists of the most memorable comedy moments in sci-fi parodies. It also highlights how spontaneity and collaboration can elevate a scene beyond what's on the script. By leveraging Moranis' comedic instincts, Mel Brooks crafted a cinematic moment that's both intimate and over-the-top, reminding us that even a towering figure like Dark Helmet can have a childish streak that leaves us in stitches. 16. R. L. Stine's surprising Spaceballs novelization. Most people know R.L. Stine as the mastermind behind the Goosebump series, the beloved horror collection that introduced generations of kids to spooky tales. But before Stine became synonymous with ventriloquist dummies and haunted mansions, he was quietly working on various writing assignments, one of which was the official novelization of Spaceballs. At the time, Stine hadn't yet reached household name status, so the chance to adapt Mel Brooks's film into a book was a unique gig, especially considering the comedic tone drastically differed from his later horror-themed work. The novelization toned down some of Spaceballs' raunchier jokes and comedic violence, aiming for a broader readership. This milder version was perhaps an attempt to appeal to younger audiences and keep the content squeaky clean enough to be sold in family-friendly outlets. Nevertheless, Stine managed to preserve much of the film's playful spirit and comedic satire. Each character, Lone Star, Barf, Princess Vespa, Dark Helmet, was given snappy dialogue that mirrored the movie's sense of humor, albeit in a format that allowed readers to imagine the visuals themselves. For R.L. Stine devotees, it's a fascinating piece of trivia to discover that the same author who terrified us with haunted masks and shape-shifting monsters once penned a comedic foray into the galaxy of Spaceballs. It stands as a testament to the breadth of Stine's writing talent, and a reminder that sometimes the creators of our scariest nightmares are also capable of making us laugh out loud in faraway worlds. Copies of the novelization have become something of a collector's item, bridging the gap between comedic parody and kid-friendly chills. 17. The animated spin-off. In 2008, more than 2 decades after Spaceballs graced the silver screen, fans got a surprise: Spaceballs, the animated series. The show aimed to parody the entire Star Wars saga, focusing heavily on the prequel trilogy that had renewed interest in the franchise during the early 2000s. It also poked fun at other pop culture phenomena of the time, doubling down on the comedic formula that made the original film a cult classic. Many of the original cast members returned to voice their animated counterparts. Mel Brooks reprised Yogurt, Joan Rivers came back as Dot Matrix, and Daphne Zuniga returned as Princess Vespa. Hearing those familiar voices gave longtime fans a nostalgic thrill. However, the absence of some key performers, most notably John Candy, was a stark reminder that this was a new iteration, not just a direct continuation. Despite the promising lineup, Spaceballs, the animated series struggled to capture the lightning in a bottle that the film had achieved. Some critics argued that the episodes lacked the same spark and comedic edge. Others felt that the show tried too hard to integrate modern pop culture references, missing the timeless silliness that made the original so beloved. The series ultimately ran for just 1 season before fading into obscurity. Still, for die-hard fans, it was a treat to see the universe of Spaceballs expanded, even briefly, into a television format. And with Mel Brooks's involvement, it served as a cheerful reminder that this parody realm still had comedic potential, even if it couldn't quite replicate the glory days of the 80s classic. 18. Perpetual rumors of a Spaceballs 2. Ever since the credits rolled in 1987, fans have clamored for a sequel to Spaceballs. Rumors began circulating as early as the 1990s. Rick Moranis once joked that he and Mel Brooks should call it Spaceballs 3, the search for Spaceballs 2, which only fueled the speculation. As each new Star Wars film arrived, folks wondered if Brooks would finally decide to send Lone Star and Barf on another cosmic escapade. When Star Wars: The Force Awakens reignited global interest in the saga, Brooks publicly entertained the notion of a follow-up, tentatively titled Spaceballs 2, The Search for More Money, a playful nod to both the in-universe joke about merchandising and the real-world potential of a high-grossing sequel. Yet, in true Spaceballs fashion, nothing materialized beyond talk and fleeting buzz. Decades later, fans still keep the dream alive. The film's enduring popularity, fueled by incessant TV reruns and fan gatherings, ensures that the conversation about a second installment never fully dissipates. With each new rumor, social media lights up with theories and wishful thinking. Would Bill Pullman return as Lone Star? Could the late John Candy's character be honored in some comedic cameo? What if Rick Moranis stepped out of retirement just long enough to don Dark Helmet's massive headgear one more time? Despite the near-mythic status of Spaceballs 2, the project has never been officially greenlit, leaving fans with a perpetual sense of hope. In a galaxy where no spoof is impossible, perhaps the continued chatter is enough to keep the legacy alive, proving the comedic force is still strong with Mel Brooks's spacefaring parody. 19. The latest buzz on the sequel. In recent years, whispers of Spaceballs 2 have grown louder, suggesting a new generation might finally see a return to the cosmos. The most tangible development came with the involvement of comedian Josh Gad, known for his work in Broadway and voice acting for major animated films. Rumor has it he's partnering with Amazon MGM Studios to explore the possibility of a sequel. His comedic sensibilities, both silly and heartfelt, could align well with the playful irreverence of Mel Brooks's universe. While details remain scarce, the idea is that Gad would both star in and produce this long-awaited follow-up, with Brooks himself stepping in as a producer, guiding the project from a creative standpoint. It's a glimmer of hope for fans who've spent decades quoting lines like "ludicrous speed" and "may the Schwartz be with you." Of course, the big question is whether the comedic magic of the late 80s can be recaptured in today's cinematic landscape. Still, the notion of seeing Lone Star, Barf, and Dark Helmet grace the big screen again, or possibly an all-new cast with cameo appearances, is enough to send nostalgia meters through the roof. If Spaceballs 2 does move forward, it could playfully lampoon the vast expansions and reboots that have dominated Hollywood in the decades since the original's release. Whether or not the project actually gets made remains a puzzle. But for now, the very possibility has fans buzzing with excitement, and that alone is a testament to the enduring appeal of Mel Brooks's comedic masterpiece. 20. A legacy of laughter. After so many years, the legacy of Spaceballs continues to shine brightly in popular culture. It's more than just a parody of Star Wars, it's a playful lampoon of an entire era of sci-fi, stuffed with puns, sight gags, and fourth-wall breaks that remain timelessly hilarious. Its jokes have taken on a life of their own, from Yogurt's relentless merchandising spree to Dark Helmet's oversized headgear. Fans have endless material to draw upon for cosplay, quotes, and references. This enduring popularity is precisely why talk of sequels and spin-offs never seems to die. Over time, Spaceballs has come to represent Mel Brooks's knack for good-natured satire. While it gently ribs the subject matter, it also celebrates the grandiosity of cosmic epics. Younger generations continue to discover it, often introduced by parents or grandparents who remember the film from their own youth. This cross-generational appeal cements its place as not just a cult classic, but a comedic staple. Whether or not Spaceballs 2 ever makes it onto the big screen, the original has already proven its staying power. It will forever be a go-to choice for movie nights, especially when audiences crave a hearty laugh at the expense of space battles and epic quests. With or without new adventures, Spaceballs remains a triumphant reminder that laughter truly is universal, even in a galaxy far, far away. And so, as we look to the stars and recall lines like "May the Schwartz be with you," we acknowledge that this gem of a parody shows no signs of fading from our collective memory, and that wraps up our journey through the wild and wacky world of Spaceballs. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please remember to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and spread the word to other fans of sci-fi comedy. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.